Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We're digging into something really fundamental for Japan today.
That's right. We're talking rice, specifically the complex world of Japan's rice distribution industry. It's constantly changing.
Yeah, and we've got a stack of materials here, articles, reports, notes, giving us a really detailed look at how rice gets from the farm, all the way to the table.
Lots to unpack.
So our mission today is to sift through all this, pull out the key insights for you, the surprising bits, and just help you get a quick grasp on who's involved, the big challenges, the trends, basically what's happening with rice distribution in Japan now.
And it's important because, rice isn't just a staple food there. It's a huge economic driver.
Absolutely. Historically, super controlled by the government, right?
Yeah.
But now it's navigating this really competitive market.
Exactly. Let's get into that history first.
Right.
Because for a long time, decades really, after World War II, rice distribution was under this very tight government system, the food control system.
Right, centralized control. But that didn't stick forever.
No, it didn't. The big turning point was 1995. That's when they abolished the food control law.
Oh, okay.
And the whole idea was to move towards a competitive system, bringing in market principles under what they called the new food law. It completely changed the landscape.
So if the government stepped back from direct control, who filled that space? Who are the main players handling all this rice now?
Well, you still have the traditional agricultural cooperatives, the JAs. They remain incredibly important. You've got the regional ones and then Zen-Nano-H, the National Federation.
Okay, still key players.
Definitely. But alongside them, you saw private wholesale companies, big trading firms, and specialized milling and processing operators really step up and expand their roles.
So it became more of a mix.
Yeah, a much more diverse system, multiple types of players involved.
Okay, so understanding that shift, how big is this industry overall today, even with all the changes?
It's still massive. The estimates around 2020 put the whole rice industry market size, so that's everything from farm to sale.
Everything included.
Yeah, at about 5 trillion yen.
Yeah. Wow, 5 trillion yen. That's hard to picture. How does that compare to, say, the rest of Japan's food industry?
Good question. It's roughly 10% of the total production value of all of Japan's agriculture and food-related industries put together.
10%. So even with everything changing, rice is still a huge economic pillar.
Absolutely, a cornerstone. But like you said, there are challenges.
Right. What's the biggest issue they're facing?
The biggest one, no question, is that the domestic market is shrinking.
Okay. Why is that?
Two main things. One is pretty straightforward. Japan's population is declining. Fewer people means less rice eaten overall.
Makes sense.
And the second...
The other big factor is changing diets. People's eating habits have shifted quite a bit.
And the numbers on that decline. They're pretty dramatic, aren't they?
They really are. If you look at total consumption, it fell by about a quarter, maybe 25%, from 9.5 million tons back in 1990 down to around 7 million tons by 2022.
A 25% drop, that's substantial.
It is. But the per capita figure, how much the average person eats, that shows an even bigger change. Okay, tell us about that.
Well, back in the 1960s, the average person in Japan ate around 120 kilograms of rice per year.
120 kilos, okay.
Today, it's less than half that, somewhere in the range of 50 to 60 kilograms per person.
Less than half. That's a fundamental shift in just a couple of generations.
Exactly. It really reshaped the Japanese diet.
But isn't global rice consumption actually going up?
It is, generally, especially in other parts of Asia, but Japan's domestic market is kind of insulated from that.
Why is that?
Because Japan is highly self-sufficient in the rice people eat day to day, the staple food rice. It's near 100%, so they don't really rely on imports for that staple consumption.
Right. So with the home market shrinking, are exports a big outlet? Are they shipping a lot of Japanese rice overseas?
Exports are growing. That's definitely a focus area, and they hit a record something like 13.8 billion yen in 2022.
Okay, growing exports.
And this is key, compared to that 5 trillion yen domestic market, exports are still tiny. A drop in the bucket, really. The industry's focus remains overwhelmingly domestic.
Got it. So massive industry, historic shift to competition, but now facing this big squeeze on domestic demand. Let's follow the rice itself. What's the value chain look like?
Sure, you can break it down into maybe 4 main stages. There's production, then collection, then milling and processing, and finally sales.
Okay, production. Starts with the farmers. What's that scene like?
Well, Japan has a lot of farmers, but many are getting older, and farms are often quite small scale traditionally.
Hmm.
But you are seeing a trend towards consolidation. Some farms are getting bigger, operating more like corporations, focusing on efficiency.
And they grow different types of rice.
Yeah, not all rice is for putting straight on the table. There's staple food rice, but also rice grown specifically for animal feed or for processing into other things like sake or rice crackers.
Okay. Then after it's grown, collection, that's where the JAs have traditionally been central, right?
Exactly. The regional JAs usually bought rice from their local member farmers, and ZNNOH, the national body, would handle the coordination, storage, selling it on nationally, often through a consignment model.
But you mentioned changes there too.
Yes, there's been a pretty big strategic shift from ZNOH, particularly since around 2018.
What are they doing differently?
They're moving more towards direct purchases from producers and regional JAs and handling direct sales themselves, trying to reduce that reliance on the old consignment system.
Why the change?
It seems to be about giving producers more say, but also about ZNNOH gaining more direct market influence and stronger price negotiation power in this competitive environment, trying to be more agile.
And the private companies are also buying directly from farmers now.
Oh, absolutely. Private wholesalers, millers,
Yeah.
they're actively collecting rice too, often using direct contracts with farmers, bypassing the JA system sometimes. That non-JA route for collection has definitely grown.
Okay, so once it's collected, the brown rice goes for milling and processing.
Right. This is where it gets turned into the white rice most people eat, but it's also where they create value-added stuff like pre-washed rice, which is convenient, or maybe germinated brown rice, which is seen as healthier.
Who owns the mills? Is it JAs or private companies?
It's a mix. The JA group has significant capacity. Companies like Zenin, No-H Pearl Rice are big players. But the major private wholesalers and specialized milling companies also operate large, modern milling facilities.
And is it just about milling, or are they getting into other processed rice products?
Oh, definitely diversifying. There's a big push into things like packaged cooked rice,
Yeah.
you know, those microwavable single servings.
Yeah, very convenient.
Huge market. And also producing rice flour, which has lots of uses, and even expanding into making things like rice crackers. It's all about adding value.
Makes sense. And the final stage, sales. Where are people actually buying their rice these days?
It's pretty spread out now. You still have the traditional neighborhood rice shops, the Komea, but supermarkets and big mass retailers are really the dominant channel for households now.
Okay.
You also see rice in convenience stores, drugstores now too, smaller packs usually. And online sales, direct delivery from farms or regions, that's growing as well.
What about businesses? Restaurants, catering, the whole food service sector?
Wholesalers supply a lot of that in bulk. But an interesting trend is that some of the really big restaurant chains are starting to go direct.
Bypassing the wholesale.
Yeah, setting up direct contracts with specific production areas or farmer groups, probably to get more control over supply, quality, and maybe cost.
And the government. They didn't completely disappear from the picture after 1995, did they? They still play a role in supply.
That's right. They don't control the day-to-day market anymore, but they maintain a government stockpile of rice.
For emergencies.
Exactly. Food security, but also for price stabilization. If there's a bad harvest or prices shoot up unexpectedly, they can release rice from this stockpile to calm the market.
Has that happened recently?
Yes, actually. In autumn 2023, there were some shortages and price spikes, and the government released about 210,000 tons from its reserves.
Okay. And what about imported rice? You said Japan is self-sufficient, but some does come in.
Yes, under international trade agreements, Japan has what's called minimum access import quotas. So a certain amount, usually a few 100,000 tons a year, has to be imported, mainly from places like the US, Thailand, Australia. But critically, this imported rice is mostly used for processing like making sake or rice crackers or for commercial food service use. It's generally not the rice people buy in bags at the supermarket for daily meals.
Got it. So let's circle back to that shrinking demand. You said population and changing diets. Can we dig a bit deeper into why diets are changing? What's pulling people away from rice?
Yeah, it's more than just fewer mouths to feed. People are actively choosing other things.
Like what?
Well, a big one is just general dietary diversification. People eat more bread, more noodles, more pasta than they used to.
Right.
And here's a striking fact from the sources. If you look at household spending, the average household in Japan has actually spent more money on bread than on rice each year since 2014.
Wait, spending more on bread than rice in Japan. That feels really significant.
It is significant. It shows how much wheat-based products have become a regular part of the diet, taking some share away from rice as the absolute core staple for every single meal, you know? It reflects a major cultural shift.
And then there's the whole health angle, the low-carb trend.
Exactly. White rice is pretty high in carbohydrates. And with everyone more focused on health, weight management, preventing things like diabetes, well, high-carb foods are under scrutiny.
The carb-off trend, as they call it.
Yeah, that carb-off or low-carb consciousness is definitely a headwind for traditional white rice.
So people are actively cutting back on rice for health reasons and swapping it out.
Yes, you see things like oatmeal, tofu, various soy products, even cauliflower rice being used as substitutes in meals where maybe rice would have been automatic before.
And food companies are leaning into this.
Oh, for sure. They're launching all sorts of low-carb alternatives, which just reinforces the trend.
Okay, so the industry sees this happening. What are they doing to fight back or adapt? How do you sell more rice in this environment?
Well, they're trying a few things. One approach is to try and make rice itself fit better with those health trends.
Make rice low carb. How does that work?
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive, but they're developing and marketing products often called low-carb rice.
What's in them?
Usually, it involves blending regular rice with other ingredients like konjac fiber or barley. These additions bulk it up but lower the overall net carb and calorie count, sometimes quite significantly, like 30–40% less. Plus, they often add fiber.
Interesting. So modifying the rice itself.
Right. And they also continue to promote traditional healthier options like germinated brown rice or mixed grain rice blends.
What about using rice in totally different ways, not just as a grain on the plate?
That's a really big area of innovation right now. Rice flour and even something called rice gel are getting a lot of attention.
Rice flour instead of wheat flour.
Exactly. Especially with the growing demand for gluten-free products. Rice flour is naturally gluten-free and can be used in bread, noodles, sweets, all sorts of things.
Is the industry pushing this gluten-free angle hard?
Definitely. You see efforts from both private companies and the government to promote rice flour. There's been some big product launches, like a major bakery brand bringing out bread made with 100% rice flour.
Okay.
And you see investments too, like Shinmei Holdings, a huge wholesaler we'll talk more about, invested in a startup that makes gluten-free bread just last year. It shows strategic interest.
And the government sees export potential here too, I imagine.
Yes, their latest export strategy specifically highlights rice, packaged rice, rice flour, and products made from rice flour as priority items. They see a global market, especially for reliable gluten-free ingredients.
It really sounds like a pressure cooker environment. Shrinking market, changing tastes.
Mm-hmm.
Does this lead to, like, a shakeout among the companies? Consolidation?
Absolutely. When the market shrinks, competition gets really intense. And yes, it leads to consolidation.
Okay.
Especially the smaller regional wholesalers are feeling the squeeze.
What kind of problems are they having?
Well, you're seeing more closures, companies just dissolving, even bankruptcies among these smaller rice shops. Yeah, it's often a mix of things. Maybe the owner's getting older, no one wants to take over the business, and at the same time, their finances are getting worse because the competition is so fierce and it's hard to pass on rising costs.
Do we know how many are closing?
One report mentioned that in fiscal year 2023, there were 88 closures, dissolutions, or bankruptcies among businesses listed as rice wholesale and sales.
88 in 1 year. That's quite a few.
It is. That number was up from the year before and actually the highest in 5 years. It seems the post-pandemic period has been particularly tough.
And did that whole situation in 2023, the shortages, the price hikes, what some called the Reiwa rice riots, did that make things even worse for them?
Analysts think so, yes. It seems many smaller shops really struggled. First, it was hard for them to even get enough rice supply at a decent cost.
Right.
And then they found it really difficult to pass those higher prices on to their customers. It just crushed their already thin profit margins. Combine that with the aging owner problem, and yeah, the prediction is we might see more closures.
So this tough environment is basically forcing consolidation. M&A.
Exactly. The government even stepped in around 2017, saying they'd support rationalization and mergers among wholesalers. And since then, M&A activity has definitely picked up. Bigger players are looking to gain scale, become more efficient, lock down supply lines and sales channels.
Okay, let's talk about those bigger players. Who are the main private companies driving this and competing?
Well, the biggest private rice wholesaler is Shinmei Holdings, or Shinmei HD. They stand out because they've been really aggressive with acquisitions.
Aggressive how? buying up competitors.
Buying competitors, but also diversifying. For example, they bought Eagle Delica, which is a big name in cooked rice processing. That really boosted their position in that convenient packaged rice market.
Okay. Smart move.
And they've also partnered with big food service chains like Watami to secure sales channels. They're building a whole diversified food group, not just a rice company.
And they have some pretty big ambitions for the future. Something about an IPO.
Yeah, that's the talk. Shinmei is currently private, but they've openly discussed going public maybe around 2023, 2024 to raise funds for even more expansion.
Okay.
And here's the really surprising part. Their stated goal is to hit 1 trillion yen in sales by 2030. That's almost triple their size from just a few years ago.
1 trillion yen. In a shrinking rice market, how on earth do they plan to do that?
Right, that's the twist. The key to that massive growth target isn't just rice, it's heavily focused on the fruits and vegetables distribution business.
Fruits and vegetables. So they're pivoting.
It seems like a major strategic pivot, yeah.
Yeah.
The plan is apparently to use IPO funds to aggressively acquire companies in produce wholesale. They want to become a dominant force in both rice and produce distribution. Some people are calling them the eye of the typhoon because they're shaking up the produce world too.
Wow, okay. That's a bold strategy. Who's the next biggest player?
That would be Kitoku Shinryo. They're the second largest private wholesaler, very established, based mainly in the Kanto region around Tokyo.
And they have a bit of a nickname, right? Something about accounting.
Yeah, they're sometimes called the accounting demon.
Why is that?
It refers to their reputation for being incredibly meticulous with their finances, very sharp negotiators, very focused on profitability. They've built a really solid business over many, many years. And they've also diversified into things like rice flour and feed rice.
And they made headlines recently about their profits, caused a bit of a stir.
They did. They significantly increased their profit forecast for the fiscal year ending in 2025, raised it by about 1 billion yen, from 1.8 billion to 2.8 billion.
A big jump.
Huge jump. And they explicitly said it was due to successful price pass-through through negotiations with business partners.
Meaning they were able to raise their prices to their customers.
Exactly. They successfully passed on the higher costs they were facing for buying rice, but this announcement got some negative public reaction.
How so?
Well, given the price hikes consumers were seeing in 2023, some people questioned if these big wholesalers were maybe profiting excessively from the situation,
I see. What's the industry perspective on that?
The counter-argument from the industry and companies like Kitoku Shinryo is usually that rice wholesaling is traditionally a very low-margin business. They'd argue they weren't making unfair profits, but were finally able to secure margins that actually reflect the risks and work involved, especially in a volatile year like 2023.
So a tension between business needs and public perception of food prices.
Exactly. It's a constant tightrope walk in this industry.
Okay, who else is a major player?
Another important one is Yamatain Corporation. Now, most people know Yamatain as a big logistics and warehousing company.
Right, warehousing.
But maybe surprisingly, rice actually makes up about half of their total sales. They have a long history in rice, too, sometimes called a cultural rice wholesaler.
And they use their logistics expertise for the rice side.
Absolutely. Having that nationwide warehouse network is a massive advantage for distributing rice efficiently. And their rice business has been growing well recently. They also just made a big move.
What do they do?
Just this month, June 2025, they announced they're acquiring a Kyushu-based company called Agricultural Best Partner.
Okay, expanding geographically.
Exactly. This looks aimed at boosting their presence and sourcing power in Western Japan, and also strengthening their online direct-to-consumer sales, leveraging their logistics.
Makes sense. Any other key wholesalers?
Yeah, you've got Muras, who are very strong around Tokyo and Kanto. They're known for large, efficient mills and being really good at just-in-time delivery, especially for pre-washed rice and the rice that goes into convenience store onigiri.
Okay.
And then you can't forget the big general trading companies, the Sogo Shosha, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Itochu, Sojitz, Marubeni.
How do they fit in? Rice doesn't seem like their main game.
It's not their core business like, say, energy or metals, but they're so huge and involved in the food sector generally that they have a significant influence.
In what way?
Well, we mentioned Mitsubishi Corporation is a major shareholder in Shinmei HD, so they have strategic input there. Mitsui & Co. is involved in both importing certain types of rice and also actively exporting Japanese rice. Itochu owns Nippon Access, a massive food wholesaler that supplies supermarkets. So Jutsu Marubeni handle a lot of the government-imported rice under those minimum access deals, and they look at overseas rice projects, too. They're woven into the fabric.
So putting this all together, it's clear this is not the static government-run industry it once was. It sounds incredibly dynamic, but also really challenging.
It's completely transformed. You've got this landscape now where the traditional JA network is still very influential, but you also have these powerful, strategic, private wholesalers battling it out. But underneath it all is that huge, unavoidable challenge, the shrinking domestic market because of population and those big dietary shifts we talked about.
And all those strategies, the diversification into cooked rice or flour, the push for exports, the partnerships, the M&A, those are basically survival tactics.
Exactly. They're necessary moves for companies trying to stay afloat or grow when the core market is contracting. They have to integrate, consolidate, find new markets, develop new products, maybe even pivot like Shinmei is trying to do.
And you mentioned that tension earlier between making money and the social role of rice.
Yes, that's always there. These companies have to be profitable to survive in a competitive market, no doubt.
Sure.
But rice is so central to Japanese culture and food security. There's still this societal expectation, this mission almost, to ensure a stable supply domestically and keep prices relatively affordable. Trying to meet both those demands, profit and social responsibility, that's the core balancing act.
Wow. It's been quite a journey mapping this out. From that post-war government control to this really complex competitive system that's now wrestling with declining demand, trying to innovate, consolidating. It's way more complicated than just seeing a bag of rice on the supermarket shelf.
Absolutely. It's an industry that's constantly adapting, reacting to some really fundamental changes in Japanese society.
So thinking about all these pressures, the shrinking home market, the global picture being different, those powerful health and diet trends, plus all this intense consolidation and strategic maneuvering by the big players, it makes you wonder, how will the very identity and role of rice in Japan continue to change in the years ahead? What does the future actually hold for this cornerstone of Japanese life?
That's the multi-trillion yen question, isn't it? No easy answers there, but it will definitely shape Japan's food future.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive today.